What I want to say is the short comparison of Roman Ingarden's and Kazimierz Ajdukiewicz reception of Edmund Husserl's theory of meaning presented in logical investigations. So I will focus only on very special aspects of Husserl's theory, the aspects that enable me to compare Ingarden's theory of meaning from the literary work of art. It was published in German in 1931, and Ajdukiewicz, directival theory of meaning, formulated in oznaczeniu wyrażeń on the meaning of expressions, published first in Polish in 1931 and developed later in Language and Meaning from 1934, published initially in German. So the comparison between Ingarden and Ajdukiewicz will be made for a particular aspect of their philosophy. I hope that it will shed some light on their general philosophical assumptions. First of all, I would like to notice that Husserl, Ingarden, and Ajdukiewicz can hardly be called philosophers of language in a modern sense of this term. Philosophy of language, or theory of meaning, because it constitutes the most important part of philosophy of language, probably, played an important role in their philosophy, but in fact it was formulated to support other fields of philosophical investigations. For instance, Husserl intended to support his anti-psychologist conception of logic. Ingarden formulated his theory of meaning to back his analysis of literary work of art. Ajdukiewicz constructed his directival theory as a background of his conventionalist and empirical philosophy of science. Well, it's worth noticing that this instrumental treatment of philosophy of language was rather typical in philosophy, even after so-called linguistic turn. Well, but from the very beginning, Aristotle, his sketch of philosophy of language of the theory of meaning from the interpretation is evidently metaphysically oriented. Locke and other empiricists, ideational or associationist or psychologically prefer theory of meaning was formulated to support their empirical epistemology. John Stuart Mill, meaning as a connotation, so externalist approach to meaning, was formulated to support empiricist psychological conception of logic and mathematics. And Frege, his theory of sense was to back his Platonic philosophy of mathematics. What is important is that all of mentioned philosophers is extended their specific results to other areas of use of language, what provoked a lot of problems with relevant philosophy of logic or philosophy of language or a theory of meaning. So now I will give a short overview of Husserl's theory of meaning from logical investigations. Of course, Husserl partially changed his mind later, but I will focus on theory on logical investigations as Ingarden and Ajdukiewicz referred to this book only. First of all, Husserl distinguishes between two meanings of the word sign. Okay? First of all, a sign is understood as an indicative sign that indicates, for a rational creature, of course, something else than the sign itself. So indicative signs are, it's a citation, objects or states of affairs of whose reality one has actual knowledge, indicate to him the reality of certain other objects of states or states of affairs. in the sense that his belief is very important here, in the reality of the one, a sign, the one is experienced as motivating a belief of the reality of the other. Here, two terms are very important from Ajdukiewicz point of view. It's the belief and motivation. So the experience of an indicative sign motivates us to experience other belief. This notion of motivation has been adopted by Ajdukiewicz in his directival theory of meaning, but evidently extended beyond Husserl. In Husserl, a motivating function of signs serves to make a sharp distinction between indicative signs and meaningful expressions, linguistic signs prefer, while in Ajdukiewicz, motivating function was not only concerned linguistic expressions, but was a basis of his theory of meaning. The function of motivation in Husserl can be explained in case of demonstration. Husserl analyzes two senses of the term demonstration. Conceived as mere indication, demonstration lacks so-called insight. Right? For instance, if a prosecutor demonstrates a so-called proof in a court, for instance, the suspect's fingerprints on the handle of a knife, it can motivate a judge to believe that the suspect is guilty. In the second sense, demonstration is conceived as a proof or a logical inference based on the objective relation of logical consequence. This relation is, as Husserl says, the ideal connection among the contents or meanings of the judgments. We recognize this ideal connection when carrying out a proof with so-called insight. Insight through ideative reflection on the contents of the judgments. It's a citation from Logical Investigations. In case of mere indication and motivation at the same time, another citation, knowledge regarding the ideal connections among the contents of the judgments concerned is quite excluded. Of course, well, we can make a little reservation. If I believe that there is a valid proof, I don't understand it, for example, and unbelief in premises, this can motivate me to believe in a conclusion, insight, ideative reflection on the content of the judgments. A necessary condition to have an ideative reflection on the content of the judgments is to treat linguistic signs not merely as indicative signs, but as expressions of a language, so meaningful expressions. This indicates logical motivations of Husserl's theory of meaning. Experiences of linguistic expressions, inscriptions or utterances are, contrary to indicative signs, phenomenally one with the experiences made manifest in them in the consciousness of the man who manifests them. So there are two experiences in the consciousness of the man. The acts, so-called essential to the expression, if it is to be expression at all, which are called meaning-conferring acts or meaning intentions, and another one, the acts that are not essential to the expressions as such, and actualizing its relation to its object, which are called meaning-fulfilling acts. These meaning-fulfilling acts are responsible, well, to reference of linguistic signs. These two mental acts, together with experiencing the physical shape of the expression, form so-called phenomenal unity. And this notion of phenomenal unity was adopted both by Ingarden and by Ajdukiewicz, who, as Ingarden himself, criticized strongly associationist theory of meaning, which stated that the act of perceiving the physical shape of an expression is somehow associated with the mental act of experiencing of an idea of the object that the expression refers to. Well, the associationists did not say about this phenomenal unity. Well, they talked about association of the experience of the physical shape and some kind of thought, another mental act. According to Husserl, the sense of an expression or meaning of an expression, or better, the type expression, is an ideal object, exemplified in meaning intention acts by so-called act matters. That those act matters is something that the meaning intention act is directed to. Well, every mental event is intentional, so it must be directed towards something. Okay, meaning intentions are directed. Meaning intentions as tokens. Okay? I direct it towards act matters. Okay, and the species of act matters is the meaning of the expression. What are the problems? The second point, the problems of Husserl's theory of meaning. Well, the first problem is very general. It's also the problem of Frege's theory of sense, at least when it's extended to natural language. In fact, there are two problems. On the one hand, how to explain the evident fact that meanings of natural language expressions can appear, can disappear, and evolve exactly like their physical reference do. Right? On the other hand, and it's the second problem, how to explain the very nature of grasping meaning conceived as ideal objects. It is Frege's position, or exemplifying of meaning conceived as ideal species of act matters in Husserl. There is a slight difference between Husserl and Frege here. The former problem is typical for all logic-oriented or mathematic-oriented theories of meaning. In mathematics, we say usually that we discover sense of expressions as something ideal, something eternal and invariable. This position is usually connected with Platonism theory of reference in mathematics. If we treat both meanings and reference as ideal objects, so if we remain on the ground of logic and mathematics, the semantics is coherent. The problem appears if we take into account reference of different status. For instance, real object, but maintain, like Husserl and Frege did, that meanings continue to be ideal objects. Well, it is difficult to believe that so-called Platonic heaven is so crowded place where ideal objects wait to be grasped or exemplified by human mental acts. On the other hand, a theory of reference with ideal meanings extended to natural language is not uniform. As it's case of Husserl, who sometimes talks about external objects, sometimes talks about their mental representations, and in general it's not very clear in respect to theory of reference. This problem has been solved radically by Ingarden, who changed the ontological status of meanings and established his own theory of reference. And in a totally different way by Ajdukiewicz, who rejected the existence of reified meanings, and at the same time rejected the theory of reference as a part of his semantics. Well, there is one unquestionable advantage of Platonism in theory of meaning. It explains the intersubjectivity of meanings, and at the same time the possibility of communication, linguistic communication. Every theory of meaning, I think, should take into account and explain this phenomenon. And now some words, some remarks about Roman Ingarden's critique and reinterpretation of Husserl's theory of meaning. So his Platonic position from logical investigation was criticized by Ingarden in the literary work of art, though Ingarden recognizes that Husserl abandoned Platonism in formal and transcendental logic. The problems that are mentioned in Husserl's theory of language were solved in Ingarden by introducing intentional objects as meanings produced by meaning intentions, and by introducing semantic correlates of expressions also as intentional objects produced by meaning-fulfilling acts. So Ingarden's response to the problem of the lack of uniformity in Husserl's theory of reference consisted in ignoring the fact of existence or non-existence of external objects, or maybe metaphorically, in putting their existence in parentheses. The intuitive background, the intuition backing Ingarden's solution is rather obvious. If we talk about something, this something must somehow exist. We can talk about nothing. Okay? So linguistic expressions refer, first of all, to intentional objects, which I propose to call semantic correlates, and sometimes they additionally hit, it is Ingarden's expression, external objects, which I propose to call their reference, if they exist, of course. A detailed ontological characterization of intentional object, as well as ontological differences between meaning and semantic correlates, can be found in the first volume of the controversy over the existence of the world. And these characteristics is based on so-called existential moments presented in 4 pairs of oppositions. There's no time to talk about it now, but it is the general characterization of intentional objects as entities that exist in a certain way. But a detailed characterization of meanings can be found in the literary work of art. Here Ingarden distinguishes between 3 groups of expressions: names, verbs, and functors. The most elaborated is the characterization of meanings of names, which are treated as very complex intentional objects, mirroring to some extent the intended features of their semantic correlates. Of course, Ingarden's theory was motivated by literary fiction. Nevertheless, with some reservation, can be applied to other areas of language and have some advantages. For instance, the distinction between semantic correlate and referent, if it exists, makes Ingarden theory to be or to work as metaphysically neutral. I will explain it on the example. For intentional objects conceived of products of mental acts of mathematicians, for example, independently on their convictions about existence or not existence, or mathematical objects as reference of expressions. Okay? In consequence, a Platonist in mathematics and a formalist can speak about the same. They speak about intentional objects, about the correlates. Okay? but they can differ in their metaphysical assumptions. And I think that the same can happen with a theologian who can be a declared atheist. Okay? It does not matter if he really believes in God. He can say something about God as an intentional object. Okay? So this theory has some advantages. But there is also a problem. For instance, intersubjectivity of meanings. Well, the same objection can be directed towards intersubjectivity of semantic correlates. Okay? Meanings as intentional objects are products of mental acts of individual language users. How then can we assure its intersubjectivity, Ingarden's response lies in some details of characteristics of meanings and semantic correlates as intentional objects. I've already mentioned that this characteristic is very, very complicated, okay? Very compound. He very often applies the notion of the form, okay, of an object, and it is somehow interwoven in meanings and semantic correlates. So I can say that though Ingarden theory works as metaphysically neutral, but it is not metaphysically neutral because the notion of form is Aristotelian notion. Okay? So I think that his basic assumptions are, in fact, Aristotelian, as far as I know. Sometimes Ingarden declared to be, well, Aristotelian, or being under big influence of Aristotle. In Aristotle, the form is grasped from individual external objects, so-called first substances, belonging to species. And what is also interesting, the form plays in Aristotle role of meaning of non-empty common names like human or horse. So Ingarden's theory, like Aristotle's theory, is anchored in reality, which is the source of basic concepts applied in his ontology and semantics. These basic concepts were questioned by Ajdukiewicz in his directival theory of meaning. And now I tell something about Kazimierz Ajdukiewicz interpretation of Husserl. Of course, Ajdukiewicz directival theory of meaning is very complex. So now I'm concerned only with some philosophical motivations of the theory, and not especially in the details of it. His theory of meaning, directival theory of meaning, is evidently science-oriented. Contrary to Ingarden, Ajdukiewicz adopted Husserl's view that the communicative aspect of language is not essential to its use. In fact, Ingarden focused on communicative aspect of language. Husserl and Ajdukiewicz, to some extent, neglected this aspect of language. Sometimes it's said that the directival theory of meaning is a pragmatic theory. I think it's a big misunderstanding. Pragmatics deals mainly with the communicative use of language, while Ajdukiewicz does not take it into account. So he very often applies the very term use, having in mind, in fact, assertions conceived as actualizations of beliefs. The crucial notion of Ajdukiewicz theory is the notion of motivation, originally applied by Husserl to analysis of science. Ajdukiewicz recognized that the very term motivation is usually related with decision and action. For instance, like in the case of a signal which motivates us to make some decision and action. But following Husserl, he applied this notion, the notion of motivation, to beliefs and extended its application to reasonings, founding, in fact, his theory of meaning on this notion. As we remember, Husserl applied the notion of motivation only to indicative signs or the communicative aspect of expressions. Husserl called it intimation. So Ajdukiewicz, going beyond Husserl, had to search the difference between signs and meaningful expressions on another ground. I'll tell about it a little later. Ajdukiewicz argumentation presented on the meaning of expressions preserves some aspects of Husserl theory, but significantly departs from it. He starts with analysis of quotations in order to indicate that when we give a meaning of an expression inside the quotation marks, the expression X, quotation marks means we give the meaning, we implicitly refer to a certain language. This leads Ajdukiewicz to analysis of the ambiguous expression to speak a language. So he finds three meanings of it. The first is evident. To speak a language is just to utter sounds belonging, for instance, to Polish phonology. But of course, it is not interesting meaning, because a parrot can speak a language in this way. Another meaning of the phrase to speak a language is to utter sounds belonging to Polish phonology, but also in experiencing simultaneously and in connection with those speech sounds, mental acts in a manner assigned by the rules of Polish to these speech sounds. Okay? So it is, generally speaking, Husserl's and Ingarden's position. And this position was not accepted by Ajdukiewicz, because he said that sometimes it happens that two different languages have expressions of identical physical shape and the same meaning. So according to the previous meaning of the expression to speak a language, when a speaker of a language A utters an expression X, he speaks in his own language, while a speaker of a language B, uttering the same expression, speak another language, language B. So they utter the same sounds and experience the same mental acts assigned to this expression by the rules of relevant languages. To avoid this difficulty, Ajdukiewicz adds to his characteristics of speaking Polish another condition. Also to do so experience the same mental acts, while having a set of dispositions to respond to Polish speech sounds, which all and only those people who can speak Polish. So here, what is essential to the last condition is the holistic aspect of language. So Ingarden, in fact, declared that he treated language as a whole and even made some reference to Ajdukiewicz. But what he had in mind was not meaning wholes, but rather some dependencies between meanings. The holistic aspect of Ajdukiewicz theory of language is obviously motivated by conventionalism, a French conventionalism, but Ajdukiewicz argument that I present here, it does not depend on it. It's totally independent. The next step of Ajdukiewicz was the analysis of mental acts we experience while speaking a language, while uttering expressions of language. So he criticizes the associationist definition of meaning. It is a rather long critique, much longer than a critique of Ingarden and Husserl. But this critique is very important because in some steps, finally, he says that we can somehow conform the demand of this phenomenal unity of the experience of the utterance and a thought, a mental act, meaning intention, if you prefer. Inside, well, the association theory, if we relax the notion of association, but as he noticed, this relaxed, very extended notion of association, though it apparently conforms this demand of phenomenal unity, is totally incidental. Okay? So talking, uttering, experiencing the utterance and having a thought in the same time is totally incidental here. So you cannot establish the notion of synonymy. You cannot find criteria for synonymy. So the next step was to analyze Mill's theory of connotation, because Mill's theory of connotation gives very, at least at the first glance, gives very good criteria of synonymy, of words, of expressions. First of all, Ajdukiewicz explicates Mill's definition of connotation in terms of beliefs. I give an example. Between the belief in Socrates having a body, being rational, etc., and the belief in the sentence Socrates is a man, there is a relation of the same type as between the belief in the premises and in the conclusion of an inference. We will refer to such a relation as motivation, citation from Husserl. This analysis of Mill's definition led Ajdukiewicz to the attempt to express his views about speaking a language in terms of motivation as a relation between beliefs. Another citation: in this interpretation, if this interpretation is accepted, then one would assume that to speak a language, it is necessary to have disposition towards particular motivational relation. Dispositions to accept certain sentences on the basis of other experiences. For instance, on the basis of certain other beliefs. So Millian approach seemed to be, to Ajdukiewicz, very promising. He did not accept Mill's externalist solution that meanings are identified with connotations, because properties can be, or attributes that appear in this definition, can be conceptualized in different ways. Moreover, beliefs do not depend on the properties as they are in themselves, but on the way they are conceptualized. As conceptualization depends on language, he abandons Mill's externalism and looks for meanings in language, as he declares. Well, but it's worth noticing that the analysis of Mill's theory leads Ajdukiewicz to accept belief holism. One cannot have one belief, an isolated belief. For instance, that we cannot just believe that Socrates is a man without believing at the same time that Socrates is a living creature and that Socrates is rational. So in his reasoning, in argumentation, he criticized some theories, but always finds something interesting in them, especially in Mill's theory. And now some final remarks. So Ajdukiewicz rejected Mill's theory formulated in terms of motivation to beliefs. He accepted that speaking a language consists in actualization of beliefs. The acts of actualization of beliefs are always somehow motivated. Ajdukiewicz distinguished three types of motivation relation that can be described as so-called directives of meaning. This notion does not appear in his first paper, it appears in later papers. So we have empirical directives, axiomatic directives, and inferential directives. So in fact, I think that meanings of expressions of a whole language, it's important to stress whole language, are given in Ajdukiewicz by the set of all meaning directives of this language. In Ajdukiewicz construction, meaning holism is inseparable from belief holism. In consequence, a partial change of set of meaning directives changes the meanings of the expressions of the language. But here, this change of meanings is something different, because in fact, Ajdukiewicz does not reify meanings. When we reify meanings, we can conceive this change, see it somehow. But we have no objects here as meanings. So these meanings are only somehow represented, we can say. What can be said also about Ajdukiewicz theory? It is not only theory that does not reify meaning. It is also theory without reference. It can be called non-referential semantics. One of the advantages of it is Ajdukiewicz theory is also metaphysically neutral, but for different reasons than Ingarden's theory. Because as it is non-referential, the problem of ontological status of reference does not appear simply. So his theory, though it was invented for rather formalized languages of scientific theories, I think it can be somehow extended after some obvious modifications, even to literary fiction. Unfortunately, Ajdukiewicz decided to define the meaning of an expression by abstraction. There are two attempts of these definitions, one on the meaning of expressions and another more elaborated in language and meaning. But both versions are based on the notion of synonymy. Therefore, sometimes it's said that Ajdukiewicz, following Husserl, treated meanings as ideal objects. I think it is serious misunderstanding and an error. We can say only that Ajdukiewicz meanings can be somehow represented by entities defined by abstraction, by abstract entities. Ajdukiewicz was obviously an empiricist, as empiricists apply the method of abstraction in constructed concepts, but it does not mean that he identified abstract concepts with ideal objects. The act of meaning intentions in Ajdukiewicz neither exemplify meanings as ideal objects, like in Husserl, nor produce meanings as intentional objects, like in Ingarden. We can only say that the totality of meaning intention acts, somehow represented by the directives of language, constitute meanings of the expression of the language. In the last paragraph on the meaning of expressions, Ajdukiewicz comes back to describe previously holistic disposition to actualize beliefs by certain motifs. And he writes, in our view, the intentional, object-directed nature of acts and the matter of acts reduces to such dispositions, what is obviously his very specific interpretation of Husserl's position from logical investigations. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the presentation. I'm afraid that we have only time for one or maybe two questions. So are there any questions or comments, please?
You can either write them in the chat or raise your hand.
Professor Wolański, please.
Jan, unmute your microphone.
Yes, okay, I know. So only one information that the last university seminar of Ingarden, was academic year 62 to 63, was devoted to Ajdukiewicz, Sprache und Sinn. And what was important, at least for me and other maybe persons, that Ajdukiewicz theory was Karnapaized in Poland. So most commentators considered that Karnapian version, namely that meaning is generated by rules of language. But Ingarden very carefully read with us this text, and we learned simply that it was not true, that meaning generates meanings rule, and in some languages closed and coherent, this is equivalent. It means that Ingarden knew Ajdukiewicz quite well. However, it was of course not das literarische Kunstwerk, but later. I don't say that Ajdukiewicz influenced later Ingarden or earlier. However, you know, what I remember that Ingarden very highly appreciated this paper.
May I? On that, because well, it was a commentary, not a question. I agree that Ingarden accepted Ajdukiewicz, appreciated Ajdukiewicz solution, and he makes some references to it, but later references it could be found in the afterward edition of on the not on the literary work, but on the cognition of the literary work of art. Okay, so he gives some hints to this theory. Especially, he likes this holistic aspect of it. But Ingarden's theory, in fact, is not holistic. Well, I don't say it as it's an error or something wrong, but it is different theory, in fact. Ajdukiewicz theory is holistic. Maybe it is the first example of meaning holism in philosophy of language.